Welcome back to the Brick by Brick podcast. I'm Ben, and I'm here with John and Ryan. And today we're going to talk about property management. Now, whether or not you are a lessor or a lessee, if you're involved in real estate or interested in investing in real estate, understanding how property management works, especially for rentals, is a vital part of understanding the real estate business overall. So we're going to jump right into it. And we're lucky for us, we have a property management expert in our midst, John Errico, one of the top property managers in all of northern New Jersey. John, I'd be interested to know from an origin perspective, first and foremost, how you got started as a property manager. And I think that would be a nice way for us to get into what property management really is.
Yeah, I mean, I killed the previous property manager.
This is on video, you know.
Yeah, no. The central premise of property management when you own an investment property is that you will have to manage the property that you own in some capacity. And I think that we talked about this in previous episodes, but I think that for a lot of investors, newer investors, is not necessarily obvious to them. They think that they will either, manage it themselves or whatever, but don't really think about what goes into that. So when I bought my first investment property, which was in Union City here in New Jersey, it was a 2-family home. Very immediately, I rented out part of the house to tenants, and very immediately we had what I would call property management concerns. For me, they were also homeowner concerns because I was living in the home as well as renting it out. But just as a basic premise, whenever you buy a piece of buy and hold real estate, you will have to manage it in some capacity. And as you scale larger and larger, that can become a bigger and bigger burden on your time or your capabilities. Before I started the construction company and did all the things that I do with Ryan that we began last year, I would say that my primary job was a property manager. I managed my portfolio in Hudson County, to some extent properties in South Jersey, and then a little bit properties in Connecticut. And that can be a full-time job. I mean, you think, well, how often can, X problem happen? Well, it might be not very often, but if you multiply that by, say, 15 properties, then it's going to happen pretty often. So as I said before in previous podcasts, like the number of times I've had to fix something leaking, like water is the enemy of homes, and water from the outside, water from your plumbing, whatever it is, the number of times I've had to deal with a water-related issue is so many, and it happens all the time. And every season has its own particular annoyance. Like winter is heating, summer is cooling, and rain. Fall and spring are like the transition period of time. So it might be too hot, it might be too cold, it might be this, it might be that. Lots of issues.
Did you set out and make a conscious decision that you and some combination of you and Shannon were going to manage your properties when you guys started acquiring, or did it just kind of naturally morph into that over time as you scaled up the portfolio?
No, I think it morphed into that. And the reason why I like to bring up the point about new property investors not realizing the management challenges is because we were very much in that position where we bought the property and we were living in it. And we're like, oh, it's no problem to rent it out to other people. And it wasn't. But along with that came the challenges of actually operating it. And the farther removed that you get from properties, I think in some ways the more difficult it can become. Mm-hmm. Like when you're living at the property, you obviously know what the problems are. And if you're observant and proactive, you can solve a lot of them before they happen. But if you're not at the property, actually during the recording of one of these episodes, I had a very large problem, which was that one of our basements in one of our properties totally flooded, like over a foot of water, and destroyed the boiler and the hot water heater, which was very, very expensive and challenging to replace in the middle of winter. So people didn't have heat also.
And being the consummate professional that you were unflappable on air. You couldn't tell.
It really was impressive given the context of what we were dealing with.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot. But as an example, I think if I had been living at that house, I probably would have thought, I wonder what that dripping sound is, or I wonder why my water pressure is low, or whatever. And I probably would have stopped the problem before it got to the extent where it destroyed this equipment in the basement. But because I wasn't there, and because I have tenants, not to denigrate them in particular, but obviously they're not either going to be as observant or know what's going on, what happened. So if you have tenants where you truly don't know them at all, or you inherit a property with tenants that are in place, Ryan and I have had this issue recently. those have been some of my least favorite or most difficult property management experiences, because the tenants, you never talk to them when they went to see the property. You have no idea who they are. They could have any manner of problems or issues that were inherited from the previous property owner that the property owner didn't tell you because he wants you to buy the property, whatever it might be. So it's
notwithstanding their merit and qualifications as tenants that may not have been, that may not have been up to par for you if you were managing it, but that the previous owner had no issues about.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a reason why there is a class of property managers, because it is a job. And frankly, it's oftentimes not a very well compensated job given the amount of work that sometimes goes into it, but it is a job. And it's one that I fulfilled for my own properties.
At any point, did you consider outsourcing it and going with a third party property manager? Or was it always, once you started, it was something that you were going to keep at?
No, I didn't really consider outsourcing it, because the class of properties that I own and that we buy are primarily single family and small multifamily properties. And finding a property manager to manage those properties can be uniquely challenging, mostly because the way that property managers make money is by scale. If you manage a single property and you're, say, taking 8%, 10% of gross rent per month, that's not going to be a lot of money. You're talking about $200-$300 at most in this area. So to employ yourself full time, you'd have to have a portfolio of maybe 20 or 30 different properties. And if you can do that all under one roof, if you can manage a 20-unit building, that's great, because you have one location, you have maybe one boiler, one roof, maybe a few hot water heaters, things like that. So to manage a lot of small 1 and 2 family properties, you're not going to find a great property manager. And I know from being in the business that there's so many bad operators in this business. Finding a good operator was going to be very challenging. And if I had the time and inclination to do it, then I might as well do it and start a business, doing it professionally, which is what I have done.
I have a ton of questions that kind of come from what you were just describing, but I think my first one would be, so if I'm trying to, let's say, house hack in an area and I want to take on property management for my individual unit, whether because I think it's cost effective, because I think I have the time, or because I can't find, to your point, a property manager that's worth, anything, that's willing to take just my one unit, what maybe are the first things that I should be prepared for? Or maybe even better, what were the first things that you realized, gosh, I really need to have X, Y, and Z in place to properly manage this property?
Yeah, it's a good question. You can sort of think of it as the life cycle of a tenant. If you're house hacking a property, you probably will have a unit that's vacant. So step one would be preparing the unit for a tenant to actually live in. And that dovetails a little bit with construction as well. But, basic things like, do all of the utilities function in the unit? Are there things in the unit that would disqualify it from being rented to a tenant, or would maybe reduce the market price of the unit? So that would all be things like, and you can even classify this in the category of preventative maintenance. So if I have a really old, say, stove in the unit, I might think, well, the stove is functional or operational, but at any time it might break. Or am I going to get the sort of tenant that if the stove breaks, it's going to be a big deal, or I have to go and replace the stove? Maybe it's just easier for me before I rent the unit to replace the stove so that I can market it as, look, the equipment in the kitchen is new. So there's a whole category of things that you might consider. You might consider painting it, for example, if the walls are, scuffed up or have holes in them, which is not uncommon from previous tenants. Just little issues that if you yourself were living there, you might want to fix. You should probably take care of them for the tenant. And then the second step is actually finding a tenant. So that is its own challenge. And there's obviously a class of real estate agents and brokers that can do that for you, either for cost or for no cost to you as the landlord, depending on where you might live. But tenant selection is its own art and skill, and there are a lot of legal issues as well involved with that, and involving anti-discrimination and whatever else. So we could delve into any of these topics more in specificity, but I would think of preparing the unit, finding the tenant, renting it to the tenant, and then after that is what you would that sort of maintenance or more management mode, which is mostly reactionary. So it's, if something goes wrong, which is usually identified by the tenant or possibly by you, you're fixing the problem. Like something is broken, something is leaking, something is whatever. And then once the tenant is gone, you're resetting that process again. So you're re-preparing the unit for rental, you're re-finding new tenants, et cetera, et cetera. And along the way, you might have things like, I want to increased rent. So how would I do that? Or why would I do that? Basic things like how do I determine what the rent is? We've talked about that in previous episodes, but those are all components that go into it.
To Ben's question about preparedness, once you get into the management stage and you have a tenant there, as John alluded to, a lot of it is reactionary. And I think one thing you can do to prepare yourself for that is to make sure that you have a lot of the requisite contacts that you will ultimately need when things hit the fan, whether that's a plumber, whether that's a handyman, whether that's a pest control company, whether that's
yourself,
yourself, or just knowing the contact info of the utility company when you have an issue with the electricity or the gas or the water. Having all those things handy will save you a lot of headache, especially if you have it centralized. And something I do is just kind of keep a note on my phone of all this relevant information. And so if anything happens, whether I'm at home or on the road, I have access to most of what I need and can generally handle things remotely.
I would imagine that the most difficult thing oftentimes for newer property managers or owner-occupiers who are managing their own properties would be during a crisis. What do I do? Who do I call? What do things cost? And obviously a lot of these things is trial and error, right? John oftentimes talks about just doing in real estate investment. I think property management falls under that umbrella of something that you could just try to do. Just out of curiosity for me, this is kind of maybe a little bit of a sidetrack, but we can look at this from two perspectives, right? A perspective of an investor looking for a property manager, and then for listeners of ours who want themselves to be property managers. So just curious, just out of curiosity for the latter, obviously if you own a property, you have your own affiliated insurance that covers affiliated issues with that property. But if you are trying to become a property manager, is there any steps you have to take with the city or the state or the municipality? Anything in particular that you can recommend, John, for people? Or I'm just curious if you have like different insurance for your property management business or something like that.
In New Jersey specifically, there are legal requirements to operate legally a property management business. A lot of them are ignored. In other states, I think that the barriers are probably a little bit less so. But in certain municipalities, you might have to register your management of the building depending on the size of the building. So larger buildings are generally more regulated. So I think in certain cities in New Jersey, if you're managing a building that's larger than like 3 units, maybe 5 units, you have to register with the with the city, and the city might impose various things on you. I'm not really even sure because it's very municipality by municipality. And honestly, these laws are not enforced a lot. Usually I would say, if you have like 100-unit building, you have an on-site management team there. If you have a single-family home, you have not an on-site management team. So there's the 100-unit building probably has a professional management team, and they might have certifications that are not legally required but are nice in the industry, like they have taken some course or some whatever it might be, versus the guy managing your single family home who just could be your buddy or yourself or whatever. So there's a spectrum in professionalism, I would say. And as I alluded to before, the space that we operate in is much closer to or identical with the single family, small multifamily space. So that's the least professional, least regulated, kind of least oversight type area of property management.
And I would just caveat that by saying I think if you're looking at this for the purposes of self-management, things are I think much less prohibitive in the sense that if you're living at the property, I don't even know if that's considered quote unquote property management if you are self-managing it.
Yeah, a lot of these laws are, to the extent they even exist, have exemptions if you are an owner of the property, even a partial owner of the property. Right. So then all bets are off. That's why a lot of bigger buildings will have on-site management that's just a part of the owner of the company, right, and they don't qualify under any really laws because they're part of the company that owns it.
And this also oftentimes applies as well for rent control and rent control exemption. Mm-hmm. I know in a lot of cities, the statute may be for buildings that are 4 units and larger, they are subject to rent control, but there's an exemption if it's a 4-unit building that's owner occupied.
Mm-hmm. You see stuff like that, I think, sometimes in Union City, where I think they're with the new ordinances that are passing, both on a short-term versus long-term rentals, and then also registering apartments for rent control. And what threshold do you cross, 2-family versus 3-family and above, where you have to register apartments for that for new investors? It's worth looking into.
Yeah, it's a good point to touch on a little bit, are the overarching legal laws that don't have to do with property management per se, but just the operation of renting out an apartment. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned rent control. Rent control is a big issue in New Jersey, and it is to some extent in other states around here, but I think New Jersey might be pretty singular in the prevalence of rent control, particularly in North Jersey. So rent control is one issue. It's city by city. We've actually been ourselves doing a research project to just document what the rent control laws are in every city, which there are so many cities in New Jersey, and there's so many different laws. It's very, very, very challenging.
Cities.
Too many cities. I agree. That's a whole nother topic.
The consolidation of northern New Jersey.
Oh, I mean, it's like they're trying to break California into 5 states, and it's like the opposite.
It starts by getting one of us or each of us on different city councils. We have to beat them from within.
In this day and age, I think it's probably a daunting challenge to unify people in that capacity.
No. Even Jersey? I feel like Jersey, maybe.
I doubt it.
Well, this is
why.
Are
you saying we're more divided than ever, right?
This is not a political
podcast. Are you telling me that Bob Menendez can't do the job of unifying the wider New Jersey?
It's a great point.
Union City's finest.
Bob Menendez. Wow.
Union City's finest.
Him and Mayor Stack.
We're big supporters of it. No, it's so that rent control is an overarching issue, and then in New Jersey, there's state level. In fact, I shouldn't even move on from the municipality level because there's still municipality issues to deal with. So there's rent control issues, and then there's also certificate of blank issues, occupancy, conformity, whatever you might want to call it, habitability. Again, every city might have their own particular take on what this is. So some municipalities in New Jersey require you to register with the city every time you get a new tenant, which could trigger an inspection. Some require you to do it when you sell the property. Some never require you to do it. Some require it for properties of certain numbers of units and above. So that's a whole nother regime. Again, the enforcement of these laws is scattershot in some cities at best, but it is something to be aware of. Once you've dealt with the municipal level issues, there in New Jersey are state level issues. In New Jersey, there's a state law that applies essentially to units, to buildings that have 3 or more families. And that requires its own registration, its own regulatory regime. And very frustratingly, the state and the municipality might be on very different pages about your compliance with various laws. It's not uncommon in New Jersey for buildings to be in compliance, or at least nominal compliance, with the state law, but not in compliance with the city law, which is very frustrating because...
Or the opposite.
Or the opposite, but I would say that I've seen it more, they have a green card, but they don't have any... A green card is essentially the registration certificate that you get from the state if you have 3 or more units in a building. But I've seen it very frequently where they have a green card or they've registered with the state, but like the city has no idea what's going on.
Right. I'm thinking about it more so from you just renovated a 3-unit building, you closed out all your permits with the city through the building department, and then after that you go for the green card inspection, and they come up with a whole new slew of things to tackle once you've already got it occupied and tenanted.
Yeah. As Ryan just suggested, it can be very frustrating because you have 2 different regimes. They're not communicating with each other. They have no incentive to communicate with each other, but you're imposed to the burden of both of them, and they both carry monetary and real penalties if you don't comply with them. So that level of expertise, if you're getting into larger buildings and you're getting into municipalities that are more heavily regulated, which is like northern New Jersey, I would say it's valuable to at least learn about these laws and be aware of them. Bigger Pockets is a resource. Talking to other investors is a resource. Networking, as we said before in a previous episode.
Listening to this podcast
Listening to this podcast, for sure. And we can go more in depth in future episodes in New Jersey-specific investing, which is its own game.
Yeah, and in some point, we're going to have an episode about short-term rentals, Airbnb rentals, which I think is a continuation in part of this property management conversation.
That's a whole nother legal regime and legal issues there, yeah.
So in terms of leasing, I realize this might be a quick step back, but is there anything you guys can advise or just give some context to? I'm actually curious because I've never seen your guys' leases. And I know also, Ryan, for example, some of your properties, we should talk about this in a second, have federally backed tenants. So Section 8 tenants, for example. And I'd be curious to know how that affects sort of the machinations of property management. But just generally speaking, just standard leases, or is there anything in particular you guys like or look for when you are leasing out your units?
Well, to the leasing question itself, a lot of this depends on what your level of interest is in being a part of the process. So for some investors, they may choose to quote unquote self-manage, but if they may be more so interested in just kind of dealing with the continuing nature of the management, but they want to leave the leasing part of it to an expert. So they'll bring in a realtor, and that realtor will then list it on the MLS and kind of handle all the showings. And in a lot of areas, that burden financially may fall on the tenant in the form of paying a broker fee. So, notwithstanding notwithstanding the fact that you're limiting the pool of tenants who may be interested in paying that broker fee, there's not necessarily a downside to doing that if you don't want to be doing it in the first place. Having said that, I think the old adage holds true that nobody's going to care as much about your property as you are. So if you want to get it done right and quickly, then the best bet is probably to just suck it up and do it yourself. I've actually heard this from a number of investors who had a rental property listed with an agent for a month or two, and they were getting kind of like intermittent feedback, and they were getting a little bit of traffic, and it wasn't renting like they thought it would. And then they took matters into their own hands and listed it, just threw it on Craigslist, Facebook, Zillow, and through some combination of those listings, they were able to get it listed at the same price within a week, purely based on the fact that they were just responding to the inquiries and they were making an effort to get people into the property when they wanted to get in there. So I think a lot of this comes back to the financial incentives here, because when you're talking about a $1,800 a month rental, the net fee, the net commission to a broker might be $500 or $600 if they don't bring the tenant. So that's not gonna, in most cases, it's not gonna get somebody out of bed, or it's not gonna get somebody to forego their showing for a $500,000 sale property and make them prioritize getting tenants in there.
Yeah, I want to, maybe your point, Ben, can be addressed through the lens of tenant identification, which is what Ryan was alluding to. Like the actual lease itself, we can talk about a little bit, and it's important to have a lease. But I think much more important is the process of finding tenants and identifying who they are. That's a deep topic, and I want to caveat delving into it by saying that it's very important to be aware of federal fair housing laws when you're finding tenants. So, I mean, it may be as obvious if you're at all in real estate, but you can't display discriminatory preferences to individuals when you are leasing properties or even selling properties based on things like race, religion, ethnic, cultural background. I'm not entirely sure if it's federally mandated, but I would just say logically it would be sexual orientation, things of that nature. So what that means as it applies to the leasing realm is that you can't put up an ad saying I'm only looking for a person of a certain age or gender or race or whatever. I mean, realistically, that does not happen anymore because people are aware of this. But it means beyond that if someone of a particular race or gender or ethnic background comes to your property to look at the property, you can't disqualify them on that basis. So usually the way that all filters down to finding tenants is that you need to apply objective criteria to tenants. One example is credit score. So you can certainly accept tenants. You can say, I won't accept tenants below a certain credit score, which is an objective criteria that you can apply to them. But it becomes much more, and it's not required, but it becomes much more suspect when you have a tenant who comes to you with a certain credit score and they might happen to be of a certain ethnic background and you reject them. That becomes more suspicious because you could say, well, I rejected them on the basis of their credit score, of which I have no actual criteria. Or you could say, well, maybe I rejected them on the basis of some other illegal or impermissible criteria. So that's a very high level overview of it. I don't think it's illustrative to go into the details of that in this episode, but it's very, very, very easy to find information about fair housing laws, fair housing acts. There also might be state-specific laws as well, but in general, just don't display discriminatory preferences towards tenants. I think it's 2019, so that's probably goes without saying. But having said all that, what I require when I look for tenants, one of the most important things to think about is how you're going to price the unit. So one thing I found in leasing is that if you price your unit correctly, you will find normal tenants that are appropriate for that area. If you price your unit incorrectly, you will find abnormal tenants for that area. You probably will still find tenant applicants, but they will just not be normal. And one example that I have is if you price your unit higher than market rent, you will still find tenants, but they will be tenants that have something wrong with them, which disqualifies them from many apartments, and therefore they have to pay more, but will try to, for whatever reason, convince you that they are okay renting your apartment. So for example, they might have a low credit score, they might have very low income, they might have an eviction on their record, they might have all sorts of stories, special conditions that may or may not be relevant to you, but are definitely going to disqualify them from the vast majority of apartments. So sometimes people will say, oh, market rent for this area is $1,200 a month, and I'm listing my apartment at $1,450 a month just to see. Well, I guarantee that you'll get somebody to come to your apartment, but they probably are not going to be the class of tenant that you're going to want to rent to. So that wasn't obvious to me before I started renting, but just because you can try to list your apartment for more money doesn't mean that you're going to, just because you list your apartment for more money and you get interest doesn't mean that you haven't listed it for too much money. So
One theme that we've talked about in a number of different contexts is the theme of understanding what your costs are. And in this case, I think the way that applies is understand that there's a cost of trying to get that maybe above market rental number, because in this area in particular, if that is a problem tenant and you need to go through an eviction, the cost of that eviction, both in terms of lost rent and the legal costs associated with going through that eviction, whatever that difference is not going to be enough. You're not going to be obtaining a significant enough premium to justify those added expenses.
Right. And it's interesting for somebody who doesn't have properties that rents to hear that perspective, because you're talking about, right, if everybody wants to try to juice their rents as much as possible, but within a margin of what the market is, you can have an extremely volatile different outcome based on the quality of tenant. And that poor quality of tenant, to both their points, yes, in the immediate might pay you a couple months at $200 more a month than market, but then there could be all kinds of other issues which may lead to, as for a variety of outcomes, maybe eviction being the worst case, and destruction of the unit itself.
On the topic of pricing, one benefit to underpricing, or at least pricing something fairly, is that you will get a wider sample of applicants from which to choose. And if you're looking at this as a long-term investment, your goal is going to be to obviously make things a little bit easier on yourself, but also to minimize vacancy. And if you have tenants in there who are paying a fair rental figure and they're qualified because they were the best of the crop from which you were choosing, then there's some long-term value to that stability as well.
Yes,
for sure. Yeah. So I think step one in the tenant identification process is listing, determining the appropriate rent for your unit. And you can list it above what you think is market rent, but the caveat is what I said before about the quality of tenants and what we just talked about. The second thing for me is I like to, at some point in the rental process, these tenants will be met by somebody. It could be by you, it could be by your manager, it could be by a broker or whatever. But that interaction is usually quite important. Not, again, for determining their, characteristics that you shouldn't discriminate on, but just for determining their possible quality as a tenant. For example, if they come into your unit and they bring, 8 family members, and you're renting a 1-bedroom apartment, and they say, "Oh, it's just going to be me and my husband," that's problematic to me because I don't know why you'd be bringing, your 8 family members to look at this 1-bedroom unit if it's just you and your husband. The biggest thing that I like to do when I meet tenants is explain to them what's going on, see their reaction, and then very importantly is have an application process for your tenants. A lot of landlords for some reason don't really do this, or their application process is maybe verbal, but it's totally legal and totally appropriate, in my opinion, to have a written application, which alone will drastically remove a significant portion of the tenants that are going to be interested in your property. So wherever you find the tenants, and I don't know if it's worthwhile to go into it because it's, it can be region specific and you could use a broker, but however you find tenants, once they come to your apartment, some tenants will be interested, some won't be interested, some will waste your time, some will cancel on you, some will whatever. But if they actually submit an application, which is a written application, which requires them to actually write something and usually pay a fee, which is usually for a credit check or a background check, that alone will remove about 95% of people that are applying to your apartment. And many times I'll get tenants, particularly in certain areas, that say, I can't figure out how to fill out the application. And I can understand that to an extent if it's maybe online and they're elderly or they don't, have access to a computer. But even if you then provide them with, say, a written application and they're unable to do it, that is a disqualification. Because if you're unable to convey to me the information that I request, for example, if you can't comply with my request for a credit check or a background check because you can't sign an application or logistically get it to me in the amount of time that's required, you're probably not going to be a good tenant. Yeah. And maybe there is an apartment for you somewhere else, but my criteria is that you need to fill out an application in some manner. It has to be written so that I can submit it to a credit agency and a background agency, and you have to pay me a fee so that I can pay the credit and background agency to do it. And normally I use a website called Cozy, which I'm a big fan of. Cozy also will syndicate your listing to certain websites online. I don't really use them so much for the marketing aspect of it, but their application process I found is great. Their fees are very low and reasonable for tenants, and the information that they give you is usually very comprehensive. So they'll give you information like the credit score, which will not be just a number, but will include things like credit inquiries, derogatory factors on their credit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They'll include a background check, but the background check won't just say positive or negative. It'll include things like, here is an eviction, which is obviously a big negative, to, here is a, misdemeanor that they got 8 years ago when they were a college student, which is probably less of an issue. All these factors are important because, sometimes you'll find with tenants will come to you, and first of all, my favorite tenants are the ones that come to you and say, okay, well, in order to rent the apartment, there's we do a credit check and we only accept credit scores above X or whatever it might be, and they'll say, oh, great, my credit is perfect. I'll say, oh, fantastic, and then I'll run their credit score, and their credit score is like 530 or something ridiculously low. I'll be like, wow, that's.
They always wonder why why say it. I mean, maybe they're trying to speak it into existence,
right? I mean, that's really concerning to me because it's a total obliviousness, and it's also lying. It's either lying to me or being so oblivious that they have no idea. And on the contrary, sometimes tenants will come to me and say, hey, I just want to be really upfront. I had a hard time 3 years ago. I had to declare bankruptcy because I got divorced or someone died or some I lost my job. Some factor like that happened. And then you see their credit score and you say, their credit score is bad, but everything stems from this one incident. It's like a 2-month period of time when all their credit card bills were late and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that still is not, necessarily good. Their credit score might be low for that purpose, but at least they've explained it, and then you can evaluate that as you might take it. The same is true with background checks. Like sometimes people will say, I've never been evicted, no eviction. Then you go on and then it's very obvious that the reason they're looking for a new apartment is because they just got evicted from the previous apartment. So it's stunning because you'll tell people like, look, I'm going to do a credit check and a background check. Not even saying like, is there anything I should be aware of? Just to let you know I'm going to do it.
And they look at you and say, good, go do it.
And then they be proactive and be like, not only did you not ask me about it, but I'm going to tell you how great I am. And then you do it and the opposite. So
it's like, yeah, you got me. Have a nice life.
I mean, you'll be It's amazing how frequent that happens.
It's interesting to hear that too. So when I graduated from high school, actually originally I worked for a property manager, and it's worth noting that every property manager, to an extent, does some variation of the process that John just described. And I know for us, like, we had obviously a credit check fee and a written application, a background check. And it's funny now hearing John, I never really thought about exactly why we did. I mean, I just always assumed, but hearing that methodology, I realized, oh, that's why we do it. But we also asked for like a good faith deposit, which you can do, I guess, which was fully refundable. For some reason, you didn't get approved, and a certain amount of security, which you guys can talk about more, being the landlords in the room. But that is very funny. And I think one of the things about property management is you can kind of take some. You got to roll with the funny moments when they come, because I imagine it can be extremely stressful and operational stress. So oftentimes you're going to see people and things that probably you wouldn't believe, especially in very specific areas in wider New Jersey.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stress can be oftentimes people just waste your time. And that's why it's sometimes valuable to have a property manager / realtor
degree
agent.
of distance.
Yeah, because people will... there's so many times when people will say, I'm so excited about this apartment, I'm going to come see it, I'm going to be right there.
Classic.
And then, they never show up, or they'll say, oh, I'll be there at 1, and you rearrange your whole schedule to be there at 1. And they're like, oh, I'm running late, I'll be there at 4. Yeah. It's like, how can you be running 3 hours late? I mean, that's insane. Right?
Well, it's funny because, and it's different. Like, it's like whether if you are a property manager or work for a property manager versus being an individual owner as well, your time constraints are very different, and your time value is very different. So that was always a brutal one.
A lot of the things that you put in place here, a lot of the things that John just alluded to, they're qualifiers, and then they serve as a filter for a lot of the bad applicants that you would otherwise receive. And while I'm sure there are plenty of applicants who will just outright ignore the fact that you're saying up front, it's going to be a 1.5 month security deposit, the rent is going to be this much, the credit score qualification is this. There are plenty of people who are going to apply anyway and just think they can get around it. But there also are a number of people who probably don't apply and who you filter out, and ultimately, that they don't waste your time because you're upfront about that stuff. And I think it's super helpful to do that, because it's only going to rear its ugly head at some point. So it's better to, filter out who you can, still have your process to kind of verify that your requirements are being fulfilled. But, ultimately, you're only hurting yourself by not having these restrictions in there and being upfront about them. So you may as well throw it out there up front, and you may as well put some thought into what your criteria actually is.
Just having some sort of process to wean out the best possible applicants.
And having rules as well. Like, if you don't want to have pets in your apartment, that's appropriate, but you need to be upfront about that. So you can't, you can't, what sometimes happens is that people will try to fool you, and they'll say, oh, I'm not going to bring a dog or something, I'm not going to bring a cat, but then they actually do. That's a violation of your lease, and that's a serious problem. It's not a problem to be like, oh, whoops, like we just forgot about it. Like, that's a serious problem. The same is true with occupancy, right? If you have a single bedroom apartment and you say, look, I only want to rent it to 2 or fewer people or 3 or fewer people, that's appropriate, because renting it to more people can be a fire hazard or a safety hazard. And somebody moves in, they have 6 people. That's not okay. That's a serious problem. So being firm about the rules and saying, like, here's what I expect will set the tone for the entire relationship, and also will prevent you from getting into serious trouble, possibly even like legal trouble with if there's an insurable issue or a fire or whatever might happen.
And having thought about that and having kind of codified this in your own way also makes it a little bit easier to enforce it down the road. Because if somebody comes to you and says, can my daughter and son-in-law move in here, or can I have a dog or a cat, or any other number of requests, it's a lot easier to say, no, I'm sorry, we have specific company management-wide policy that prohibits this, versus saying, no, I'm just going to be the bad guy today and tell you no.
So out of curiosity, we talked about some of the thresholds of getting tenants in, and what are the kind of standards that you can outline to try to get in the most qualified tenants at paying the maximum rent you possibly can for the area. I'm curious, you get a tenant in there and they don't pay rent, or they're violating as we just talked about, maybe it's the animal policy, or it's, again, just being late on rent, what have you. What are your processes, and what are certain methods property managers can take to try to address these issues, very common issues?
So there are a lot of there are property managers that operate on both sides of the spectrum, and either side of the spectrum can be very negative. There are property managers who are extremely lackadaisical and have no conception of what's happening at their unit or their apartment, and literally just show up to collect a rent check. That's bad for obvious reasons, because you're probably not solving problems. You're probably not aware of what's going on in your units or your buildings. So that can cause a whole host of issues. The other extreme, which you might think doesn't happen, but I've actually seen all the time, and in fact, Ryan and I have been talking about this recently, are property managers or landlords that are so involved in the lives of their tenants that it truly becomes a problem. You have, and on both ends of the spectrum, your behavior will set the expectation in the tenants. So if you're the sort of property manager that doesn't deal with anything, then tenants will never tell you when there's a problem, because they just expect that you're not going to deal with it. On the flip side, if you're the property manager that is really involved in every aspect of your tenant's life, they will tell you everything that's wrong, even things that are unreasonable for you to care about or fix, and expect you to be involved with them. So like I know landlords that have gotten into like roommate disputes with their tenants, which are totally beyond the scope, I would say, of a landlord, to the extent that, if they're all in the lease or whatever, like, I don't care what happens as long as you pay. I don't care if you don't like your roommate that you yourself picked, et cetera, et cetera. Landlords that will do things like, if there's a slight minor issue in some, totally irrelevant way to the apartment, where they'll move heaven and earth to fix this very minor, bizarre issue that is like maybe unfixable or just is not economically viable to fix, that nobody would really care about. You wouldn't care about if you lived there. So there's a whole range of spectrums. Maybe Ryan, people like this also, right?
Yeah, I certainly echo those same sentiments. I would like to point out, on the larger scale side of things, this is a little bit of a tangent, but it does speak to the point of, as a property manager, having your pulse on the property. I know it's pretty common in the investment space to buy a 50-unit apartment building and to approach the investment from a value add perspective with the intention of getting rents up, and, as we alluded to in the last episode, bumping NOI and improving the property that way. But oftentimes, one impediment to that is that you may have a certain cross-section of your tenant pool that is involved in some type of illicit behavior, or that is doing something to otherwise stigmatize that building, that community, that block maybe. And one benefit of being a property manager who has your pulse on the property is who those one or two bad eggs are in the building. And if you nip that issue in the bud, then you may not get to the point where your building is only 50% occupied because nobody wants to stay there, because they know that the building is, a haven for drug dealers, or if there's other behavior there that is going to deter your tenants from wanting to live somewhere where all they want is just a safe, quiet, secure place.
Yeah, and I think part of the issue, one big name of the game, is communication. This is the case for like whenever there's problems or conflict, but in the property management space, being responsive to tenant issues is important, even if your response is no, I won't deal with it. So, I had a tenant recently that, this is in fact in the same building that we had an issue with the heating and the hot water from a flood, and we had to make a small hole in her wall to fix some plumbing. And for various reasons, we had to leave the hole uncovered for 2 or 3 days. And, this is like a hole maybe 6 inches by 6 inches in a corner of a room. And the heating was working, the water was working, everything was on, just that there was this hole in the room. And she said, will you pay for a hotel for me because of this issue? And I certainly didn't ignore her, but I just said, no, like, that's not reasonable for me to do that. And I don't want to be, and she had all these reasons why she didn't want to do it, and why it was such an inconvenience for her, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, look, I don't want to be inconsiderate to your concerns and your, maybe unique life history that makes it so that this is very inconvenient to you. But from the perspective of my duties as a landlord to you, this is not an appropriate thing for me to do. So no, we can't do that. And so being the the bad guy, I guess, in that context is definitely a necessary thing. To your original point, Ben, about like what happens when things go wrong, a lot of it is like communication. So hopefully you have tenants and you have a relationship with tenants such that they'll tell you when things are going wrong. Like if they're going to be late on rent, they'll tell you in advance, like, hey, I'm having a problem. That still is not necessarily okay or great, but at least you're informed. But if you're not communicative or your tenants aren't communicating with you and the day to collect rent comes and there's no rent, that is a big problem. The worst tenants that I've had are ones that either don't communicate, will lie, or stop communicating when things go wrong. So, Ryan and I have several tenants right now in a building where we inherited tenants from the previous owner. And, we were talking earlier in the episode about how that can be problematic. We have, these tenants are super bad. They're bad because their expectation for communication set by the previous landlord was totally off. So they don't say when things are wrong, or they will over communicate when certain irrelevant things are wrong. They won't tell me about when rent's due. They have all sorts of crazy assumptions. I mean, I had one tenant claim that he believed that so rent is generally paid on the first of the month for the month that you're in. He claimed that his belief was that rent should be paid at the end of the month for the prior month that he'd already lived in the building for, which is just, I've never heard of that. And
it's like, sir, what does that have to do with you having not paid rent for 3 months?
Right. So
it's like, I feel like usually it's a microcosm of a wider issue. Yeah.
So to return to your initial question, like when things go wrong, step one is communication and just understanding what's happening. And certainly there are legitimate reasons why people can be late in rent that are not eviction quality events.
Yes.
But knowing what they are will prevent that from happening.
Although I would imagine, and I think anybody would agree with this sentiment, that if you feel like a tenant relationship is going in that direction, to probably document as much as you can, or keep track of as much as you can in terms of any issues you've had with a tenant.
Yeah, text messaging and email have been great boons for that as opposed to verbal conversations. So a lot of times I communicate with tenants through text, and that's a great medium for just keeping information right there. The ultimate problem with a tenant is when they are, the tenant can do a lot of things to make it such that they can't live in your unit anymore, or you won't allow them to live in your unit anymore. And obviously, if you just don't like the tenant personally, or whatever, you just don't think they're good tenants, that probably in alone is not enough to qualify for you to remove them from their property if they're not violating their lease agreement. It might be a justification if you're not in a rent controlled or rent stabilized or whatever situation for you to not renew their lease in the future. However, there are overarching legal issues, as I alluded to before, that might cause that to happen. But generally, the number one reason why people get evicted or why leases end are because of a violation with the lease, which is usually non-payment of rent or habitually late payment of rent. Other issues could be, they are subletting your apartment without your consent. They have other people living in the apartment without your consent. They're violating some rule that you've imposed, like with animals, with doing illegal activities in your unit. Maybe they're destroying your unit. They're inconveniencing other tenants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I've very rarely ever dealt with the latter, but non-payment of rent or late payment of rent is a reality. If you manage enough properties in any area, affluent or poor, you will find people that are going to be late with rent or not pay rent.
I just want to say, out of curiosity now, sort of having now gone through most of the rental process and management process for market tenants, I do want to have a quick conversation about rent control, rent stabilization, and Section 8 as it pertains to units that we have, or that you have, Ryan. So maybe you guys can take us through a little bit in the same overarching context. What is the difference, if there is one, between managing at market tenants and rent control, rent stabilized Section 8 tenants, maybe outside of just the obvious fact that there's a certain cap on rental increases, et cetera?
Sure. Well, I think it's worthwhile to take a step back and just to think about what Section 8 is and what that really means.
Yes.
So the way that it generally works in the context of, the 2 to 4, 1 to 4 family rentals is a quote unquote Section 8 tenant comes to the landlord with essentially a Section 8 voucher. I think it's called a HAP voucher, for Housing Assistance Program. And that voucher is generally good for a particular amount of money per month. Generally, as there's a formula that's generally based on either affordability metrics for the area or a percentage of that tenant's income that should be allocated to rent. And then the tenant picks up one portion of the rent and the Section 8 voucher covers the rest. So in this context, these Section 8 vouchers are essentially it's a means of the government stepping in and providing housing assistance to lower income families.
And just as a quick caveat, there are a lot of programs like this. Section 8 is one particular program that's it's funded by the federal government, although it's actually operated by municipalities. But there are many, many, many programs like this for low income or disabled or other category of tenant where, for whatever reason, they have government assistance to rent a unit. And Section 8 is the most common one that landlords will deal with, but all of these things that I think Ryan is about to say will apply in a similar manner to a lot of these programs.
And sometimes you may find tenants who are using a combination of one or two or maybe three different programs. So to me, the overarching theme is the same. You want tenants who are going to abide by the lease. You want tenants who are not going to create issues and who have realistic expectations, regardless of whether they're market tenants or whether they are paying through some means of housing assistance. When it comes to Section 8 or other housing programs, I think you generally find within the investor community, you'll generally find that investors are either really far on either end of the spectrum. So they either love them and swear by them, or they had one bad experience with it and have written off these programs entirely. I think the reality of the situation is that it's case by case. You're going to have excellent tenants who are on some form of housing assistance, and you're going to have some tenants who are quite subpar when it comes to these or on these housing assistance programs. And it's on you as the landlord to screen them appropriately and to ensure that regardless of what their means of payment are, that they are qualified to lease your space.
Right. So in my experience, government subsidized tenants, first of all, in general, you will find a very wide array of tenants that have government subsidies. Some Section 8 tenants will be, in Section 8, you can just, parenthetically your mind for government subsidized tenants. Some Section 8 tenants will be fantastic and some will be terrible. And as Ryan alluded to, the voucher, which is the amount that the Section 8 tenants' rent will be covered, can vary a lot. It can be 100% of your rent to much less than that. Back of the envelope, sort of high level talking, usually tenants that pay more money, even though this sounds counterintuitive, are better tenants because they have more of a financial stake in where they live. If you have a tenant who's paying truly zero because the government program that they're on pays their entire rent, they have really no financial incentive to do or be anything in your apartment. And although this hasn't happened to me, I know people that it's happened to. These tenants can just trash your apartment because they have really no financial consequences for that happening. So if they, for whatever reason, don't like you or are having a bad day, they can really cause you financial penalty without themselves being financially at risk.
To be fair, the ramifications of their behavior in that situation would be that they would lose their housing assistance payment, which is not insignificant.
Out of curiosity, does the federal assistance cover things like credit check fees and security deposits? Like if you're renting to one of those tenants, what is is the process different in terms of the source of funds for those initial fees, or no, the tenant is still on the hook for those payments?
It depends on the program.
Okay.
Oftentimes, as Ryan alluded to before, tenants can use multiple programs. So, I have a tenant in one of my properties that isn't actually a Section 8 tenant, as in she pays market rent out of her own pocket. However, for her security deposit, her security deposit was paid through a program through the city of Newark that provides emergency housing relocation because her building was condemned or something like that. And so she didn't get her deposit back, or she might at some point or whatever. So there's a whole variety. And yes, there is assistance for application fees and, whatever else might be in relocation fees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, one other downside to a lot of these programs is they are generally administered by some agency. So in this case, I think there's either, I don't know if it's at the city level or at the county level, but there is a local Section 8 office that administers the program in each of these locales. And those offices We'll conduct periodic inspections. I don't know if is it yearly or biannually?
I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. It certainly depends on the program, but it happens not infrequently.
Right. But just as we alluded to earlier with the state and the city having different requirements, this just adds a third layer of oversight. And it's just another body that comes out and will say, hey, you need to paint this wall, or you need to fix this door, or you need to do that. It's not necessarily that these things are unreasonable. It's just that the frequency with which these things happen and the ramifications of not being in compliance, whether these requirements are reasonable or not, can be significant. If they're not cured within a certain period of time, they will stop paying the rent, and it's just another source of frustration.
Yeah, it's bureaucracy, and to be honest, a lot of these programs are not administered particularly well.
Right.
And that can be very frustrating from a landlord perspective. Like, one of the craziest things that we've had to deal with, I think, is we have a Section 8 tenant who is very habitually late with her rent. She always seems to manage to pay it, but is very late normally. And her income portion, her portion of the rent is maybe like a third or something of the total rent for the unit. So most of the rent comes from the local Section 8 office. However, if she is late on her rent, she will be out of the program, which means that we won't get Section 8 income anymore. So it's a pretty perverse incentive where I'm actually incentivized, if I want to get that 2/3 of her rent, and if I think that at some point she will actually pay, I'm actually incentivized to tell the Section 8 office she's paying her rent on time so that I get the 2/3 of the rent.
Which is just ridiculous.
Right. If I say that she's out of the program, boom, she's out of the program. If I say she didn't pay rent this month, they want to be helpful to me. So they say, oh, great, well, she's out of the program. Well, okay, fine. But now I have to, that doesn't mean that she leaves the apartment.
Right.
It just means
that through some sort of eviction
process.
Right.
It just means that I don't get the Section 8 component anymore. So then I have to evict her, which in New Jersey is a multi-month process. I have to go through everything else involved with that, try to get money from her for those other months without Section 8 assistance. It's just not going to happen.
Is there a process where you can document through Section 8 or other programs like this, hey, listen, they're late, but they've been paying, so I just want to note this for if I need to pursue other options down the line? Or it's an all or nothing game with these federal programs?
These are two different regimes. So there's the Section 8 regime, and then there's the eviction regime.
Well, but I just mean for Section 8 purposes, right? Because you're saying that if you don't tell them that he or she is paying on time, they'll revoke the federal funding.
Well, you can accept, you can say she's paying late, but I have no problem with that.
Yes,
that's fine.
Okay.
Or you could even say, hypothetically, she doesn't pay rent at all, but that's no problem to me.
I'll just take your 2/3 and okay.
Yeah, you can do whatever you want. I mean, there's no requirement. I mean, the relevancy though is that if you want to evict her, as we said before, a legitimate, legally okay reason for eviction is habitually late payment of rent. But there's no inconsistency in my mind from saying she's still in the Section 8 program or he's still in the Section 8 program because I'm okay with the fact that they're paying rent late. However, I'm going to pursue eviction for them because they're paying rent late. I mean, that might be a little weird, but I mean, I'm sure that happens all the time if you wanted to. I mean, normally, again, in Section 8, the majority of your rent is coming from the Section 8 program. So yeah, it may suck to get, a third or less of the rent late, but if you have a Section 8 tenant and they're generally okay otherwise, that's probably an okay calculus for you to make, is say, look, I get the late rent. It's late it's late by 10 days every month, but at least I get it. And then I get my 80% from Section 8. I'm okay with that. That's fine.
So transitioning now from Section 8 to maybe and other federally backed programs to rent control and rent stabilization. And it's important to note, I know that's not the purpose of this episode, but to understand that when you're investing in properties that classify or have tenants in these programs or under certain types of rent control or stabilization, that should and will change your investment thesis. But now I know in the city from my previous work experience that, for example, New York City, sorry, excuse me. I just assumed that you all know. Didn't you roll out the red carpet? Did you know I was from New York? Just kidding. There's no pretension on this show.
The New York Post that's constantly up to my car might be.
You mean the People's Paper?
People's Paper.
I'm scared to say that on this show because that's going to catch on. I need to trademark that. So more importantly, looking at the way that, for example, rent stabilization grows, I know it was usually mandated between 1% and 4% per year of whatever rent it was below a certain threshold in New York. So I'm just curious to know, like in Union City, for example, where there are very strict rent control and stabilized rules, what the process is for a landlord there and what to expect if you're managing a property that has these kinds of controls on them.
The benchmark that most rent control programs are based upon is CPI, Consumer Price Index. Generally, there's a permissible increase of maybe a set amount, like 3%, or so it's either the greater of 3%, or the greater or the lesser of 3%, or CPI. Sometimes it's CPI plus 2%, and oftentimes there are other permissible increases. For example, if you have to go in and replace a roof and your apartments are all falling apart and you have to spend $50,000 in capital expenditures, there's generally some type of capital expenditures increase that you can pass through. Sometimes it burns off after it's been quote unquote repaid. Other times it becomes the new baseline.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole, as we alluded to before, in New Jersey, each city has their own particular rules and regulations. And so it's very hard to say a blanket statement about how it works. But for the purposes of you as a property investor, it's important to know, as Ryan said, what the well, first of all, it's important to know, is my building subject to rent control at all? Because there are reasons why your building might be and might not be, even if the general rule is that all buildings above X are rent controlled. Yours may or may not be for various reasons. If it is, then the question is, what is my permissible increase in rents, as Ryan alluded to? And also, are there other exemptions that might allow me to decontrol or reset rents? So one exemption that's pretty common is decontrol on vacancy. So while a tenant is in the unit, the rents can't be increased by a certain amount. But when they leave the unit and the unit is quote unquote vacant, you can then reset rents to market rate. That's sometimes happens in New Jersey. Depends on the city. The other more extreme version is that the stated rents or the registered rents follow the unit regardless of its vacancy status. So even if the unit's vacant for a year, it's still subject to the same rent control regime laws that have been in place prior to it being vacant.
And sometimes it requires that the entire building become vacant before, so you can't decontrol unit by unit. Sometimes the entire building must go vacant. Yeah. At the end of the day, all of this stuff is extremely nuanced, and the only way to truly understand it, if you're going to make an investment of this scale, is to read through the rent control policies in detail. There are always little nuances to it that can either be an opportunity or an impediment. It may be an opportunity to pass a cost through and to make the numbers work, or it may be an impediment to what your strategy may have otherwise been. Mm-hmm. So it's important to note what all these little limitations are.
Yeah, and just as a large big picture thing, it's really important to know that when you buy a property, it could be subject to rent control in some of these areas. I've seen it far too often where some person buying a property will say, "Oh, well, my real estate agent said there's no rent control," and I might be familiar with the municipality. Well, that's not true. I mean, like your unit will be subject to rent control unless it's open to whatever exemptions or exceptions that I don't know are applicable. So don't, like, your realtor is incentivized to sell you the property, and they might not know the truth. Even everybody involved in the transaction might not know the truth. Maybe the landlord, the current owner of the building that you're buying, thinks it's not subject to rent control, but it really is. And that's a problem because
huge difference.
At some point you're probably going to be hit with that during your ownership of it, and it's certainly going to affect the value of the property as well. So, like, I'll see buildings in Hudson County, say, that are, every city in Hudson County has its own form of rent control, but it's usually very strict. And I'll see 6-unit buildings, and they'll be going for $1 million plus, which would be market for a 6-unit building if it wasn't rent controlled. But then you look and see the registered rents are half of the market rents, and that reduces the value of the building by 50%. Mm. And, if you don't know that, basically either the owner of that building is looking for someone dumb enough to not know that there are rent control laws, or himself has no idea about rent control laws and just been illegally renting all of his units out for however long. In either way, it's a big problem for you, and you should inform yourself. Even sometimes lawyers will not know this information, particularly because of the nuances in New Jersey specifically of city by city, municipality by municipality laws. So either ask someone knowledgeable or ask your lawyer to look into it, or do the research yourself.
All this is not to say don't buy rent control buildings. It's more so to say understand what you're buying before you do. Because at the end of the day, there are still some advantages, while few. There are some advantages to owning these types of buildings. One of which is the fact that if you have a tenant who's been in an apartment for 15 years paying $1,000 a month in a unit that would otherwise rent for $2,000 a month, then that tenant is highly incentivized to do whatever is necessary to stay in that apartment, whether that means prioritizing paying rent or not being a thorn in your side or a thorn in the side of the landlord, or, just keeping the place in generally good condition. There are some advantages to that when it comes to occupancy and when it comes to stability. But, at the end of the day, the numbers are what the numbers are.
Yeah. And very briefly, not about management per se, but if you want to be a value add investor and you're buying a rent controlled building, that's going to pretty significantly limit your opportunities to add value to that building. Because as we've talked about in previous episodes, in an ideal world, the value of an investment rental property is a function of your income, your gross income, which are your rent and your expenses. And assuming your expenses are generally going to be fixed, if you can't increase rents, increase income, then the value of your building is not going to increase. So buying a rent controlled building where there are truly no opportunities to ever decontrol it or raise rents or do whatever else, you're either hoping on A, the law to change, which has happened, or B, you have no appreciation value add play. You're just happy with the cash flow as it is, and you're going to increase it at 2% a year, and that's it. So
excellent, gentlemen. Last question before we head out, because we all have dealt with this and are dealing with this. I'm going to talk about market tenants here, not stabilized, controlled, or federally backed tenants. Security deposit. How do you guys operate with that? I think there's always a lot of questions, and sometimes that can be the most contentious aspect of a lease period at the end for a market rate tenant. Obviously, the standard would be if something goes wrong, you use that money, a portion of that money, to fix issues. But do you guys have certain thoughts on it or policies on it? I'm testing you.
My one thought on this is that you're bringing this up to bring to the forefront your sterling record.
I was not going to bring it up. I was not going to. I promise I wasn't. I was curious.
Ben prides himself on having his security deposit returned in full in every apartment he's ever lived in.
Specifically consulting on how to get your security deposit back? Yes, that is true. But I promise I wasn't going to bring it up. I just wanted to put it in your mind.
Notwithstanding that, the topic of security deposits is an important one. Mm-hmm. In a lot of situations, the security deposit that you are holding on to may be your only point of leverage in a dispute with a tenant. That's not to say it's something that you should be holding over their head and exploiting. But if you have a tenant who has not paid rent, if you have a tenant who has or who may trash the apartment, has any reason to be upset with you, whether it's justified or not, if you're holding on to a month or a month and a half worth of rent in the form of a security deposit, then that's one thing that's at least going to deter them from doing that.
Cool.
Yeah. I mean, I very rarely have taken people's security deposits or a portion of the security deposit. I mean,
respect.
The idea from a landlord perspective is that there's going to be reasonable wear and tear. I mean, this is even a legal issue about the legal bases on why you can keep a security deposit. But reasonable wear and tear would be things like little dings, nicks, holes in the wall. I mean, I anticipate basically every unit is going to have to be repainted in between tenants.
Yep.
But unreasonable things would be like they've punched a hole into my wall, or they've ripped up flooring, or they've destroyed a vanity or something like that. And obviously some of it is dependent too on the length of time the tenant has been there. Like a tenant there for a year is going to be a lot different than a tenant there for 10 years, for example. So it's hard to say a blanket statement, but for me, it goes back to tenant selection again. Mm. So if you select quality tenants, and then beyond that, if you communicate with them, one thing I like to do is, for a lot of my units, I provide pest control services, which means that an exterminator goes into all my units and will spray for bugs. And that's a great excuse to just get in the unit. I mean, obviously, tell the tenants in advance this is going to happen and set their expectation for it. But that's a great rationale for getting in the unit every month to just see what's going on. So,
you're really clever.
Yeah, I've gone into units before and you'll see crazy stuff. Like I was in a unit not too long ago where the tenant had had put in a huge lock to the basement, which is a common basement, and where all the utilities were, and the water shut off, the electricity shut off, and didn't give anyone the key. Like only they had the key. And and obviously at some point I would have figured that out, but I think it had happened maybe a few days before or something. And I was like, this is crazy.
What
like
was the response from
you
the
would have
tenant?
figured it out
That's
when you had a
amazing.
leaky boiler in the basement and you had to get in there in an emergency.
I mean, the response was like, "Oh, I didn't even think about it." Blah blah blah. Something crazy, or like I'm storing my stuff down
I
there,
didn't
which
even
is
think about it. You
impermissible, but
actively brought someone in to deadbolt the door to the basement.
It's crazy.
crazy,
more
God, people are nuts.
Yeah, more crazier things will be like they've taken down every smoke detector in your unit, or they've like blocked the escape door, or they've made it so that every window is inoperable. Things like that are safety issues that could have ramifications on you, but also are just I don't want you to die in my apartment. So
Absolutely.
This isn't on the topic of security deposits per se, but while we're at it, I think John's story there reminds me of a few things that I think are worth touching on, just when it comes to setting expectations with tenants. John, I don't know how you feel about this, but do you have anything that you either put in leases up front or divulge to your tenants at the beginning to kind of like set certain expectations? Like I know one thing that we put in that I think has been recommended to me by a few other investors is to say that as a blanket statement, any repairs under $100 or so are on the tenant's shoulders, so that you're not getting calls about things like light bulbs needing to be replaced. Do you have anything like that as a general operating practice?
I don't do things like dollar amounts, but I will do things like I will have rules about keeping things clear from access ways, pets. Pest control is a big one. Lead paint is a big one. Like that's a whole nother topic that we can get into. But lead paint,
anything trash or recycling. I know we've gotten dinged in the past for we had new tenants move into a space, and we weren't as clear as we should have been about the city's requirements for trash and recycling, and so we ended up getting
or even just the expectation that they need to be taking their trash out to the curb or not, for example. I've never heard about the dollar amount one. I think.
I mean, the obvious downside to it is if you get a tenant who tries to interpret that too literally, and they see something that they could probably fix for under $100, and they take that on, and then they do it incorrectly, and it either needs to be redone in the future by you, or it leads to a bigger problem. And that's obviously counterintuitive.
I would prefer them to call me, and then just for me to say no, than for them to just not even bother, because they have let's be honest, people don't read these leases, so it is what it is. But
it's like the agreements on iTunes. You're just clicking I accept. We all know it.
Take all my information.
Right. I mean, and that is problematic, because there are enforceability concerns with some of these leases that you can really get into if you have litigation relating from it. But
I was going to say too, to that last point about reading your lease. I remember the first lease I signed on my first apartment in the city, that deep buried in, section 24, subsection 1, subsection 1A or something. There was a little note about no matter what, a $500 move out fee that was just affiliated for no purpose other than to further take money from you as you went out. There was no stipulations. It was literally just a move out fee. Mm-hmm. So by catching that before we signed, by reading through the lease, we were able to have that taken out of the part. But I'm not saying everyone's trying to get you, but it's worth doing your due diligence when you're signing a lease, and as a property manager to probably not do things
for
like
commercial leases.
Oh my God, it's not even.
It's like going to lease a car and having a 36-month lease, and then them charging you a disposition fee at the end. Well, it's like, my lease is over. Obviously, the car has to be returned. Why am I getting charged? Like, should that be built into it?
So I think the moral of the story here, to sum up, of what has been a very informative property management episode, is first and foremost preparedness, making sure you have the right contacts when you endeavor yourself to start out as a property manager, understanding and creating a process for identifying and leasing up your units and working with tenants, and then also understanding the market around you and what is your thesis for property management, right? What kind of tenants are you managing, and tailoring, I think, your process and processes to dealing with issues to whatever type or kind of rentals you're working with.
Yeah, if I can touch very briefly on the team aspect.
Sure.
Which is, so probably the most important person that I used when I was getting started is my handyman, whose name is El Chapo. No relation to the more famous El Chapo. Ramon is his Christian name, shall we say. But We actually found him by going to a hardware store locally, and we said, "Hey, who's a guy that shops here a lot? Like, is there someone that you'd recommend?" Which is a great technique for finding local guys that are active in the area. And we found him through that context, and he is what I would say like the definition of a handyman. He also can do larger projects, and he actually works for us now in our construction company, but he can do a little bit of almost everything. And if he doesn't know how to do it, he probably knows somebody else that can do it. So he's been fantastic because, even when I was living in a unit of a building that I rented out, if I had a small emergency or a small issue that I couldn't fix, like a small leak or whatever, the fact that he was responsive and was able to do it, and I didn't have to call a billion different people, I wouldn't call him like my property manager because I didn't pay him a flat fee, and I paid him like per job. But just his being there was very, very important to me, and I don't think I would have had the confidence to expand the way that I did without him. So when you're starting, if you're thinking about expanding in a particular area, finding even not a property manager, but just like a handyman type person that you can reliably call on for a range of small issues. I mean, I'm talking about like the toilet's clogged, like whatever else is going to be very important. It's been very helpful.
One thing that John's point here just reminded me of is another point that we've actually discussed at length in the past. And it's the idea of self-managing properties at some point in your real estate career. I know it's actually something that I personally dislike strongly. I would say something I loathe really is property management. But at least our first rental property, I still manage that along with my brother. And while it is frustrating, it's been a truly formative experience in my real estate career because it's brought to light the reality of owning property, both the good and the bad. The reality is that it's not as scary as I may have thought, but it also does come with certain challenges. And there's no substitute, in my opinion, for firsthand experience. And I think regardless of whether you see yourself as a property manager in the future, I think it should be a prerequisite for every rental property owner or future landlord. I think it should be a prerequisite to have some experience managing property firsthand.
Yeah, and you might find that you're just not cut out to be an operator, like a hands-on property manager as a landlord. I mean, if you're the sort of person that doesn't like confrontation or doesn't like people being upset at you or angry with you or can't figure out that like some problems are more desperate than other. I mean, I just got a funny text that I shared with these guys about someone said, there's an emergency at the property. The dryer is not drying my clothing. If you're the sort of person that would take that text in seriousness and call over a repair person that moment to resolve the issue, and can't contextualize that with an actual emergency, which is like, hey, I don't have heat, or there's water flowing through my apartment, or whatever else. Like, again, that may not be, there's not something wrong with you. It just may not be the type of, investor that you should be. So we've dealt with that too on the construction side. We have people that are just, as I've mentioned before, about too involved, like people that are just really, really, really too involved in things that go on the property, and they can't figure out when a request is unreasonable, or though hypothetically reasonable, doesn't need to be taken care of the moment that it is received. So it's something to learn, I think, by going through it.
Gentlemen, thank you for your time and expertise as always. For the folks listening at home, make sure you subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast, or reach out to us on the Brick by Brick, that's Brick X Brick Facebook, and make sure to listen to us on iTunes and Spotify. Thanks for listening.